Ja, välkomna allesammans till dagens webbinarium som Föreningen för samhällsplanering håller i. Och vi kommer föra en spännande inblick i Rosa Danenbergs forskning, Main Streets as Resilient Public Spaces, zoning in on ground floors in Stockholm. Och jag tänker innan vi drar igång så vill jag bara kort berätta om Föreningen för samhällsplanering. Jag heter Märta Fröjd och jag är ordförande i Föreningen för samhällsplanerings lokalavdelning i Stockholm-Mälardalen. Och jag vill slå ett extra slag för att kika in på vår hemsida som står här. Så att ni inte missar några av våra kommande aktiviteter. Och det är både i Stockholmsavdelningen men även i resterande delarna av landet. Och då får ni gärna bli medlemmar också. Är man medlem så får man utskick och man får även vår fantastiska tidning Plan. Och vi erbjuder även företagspartners och organisationsprenumeranter. Och närmaste tid så ses vi den 4 december på en AV i Stockholm på Scandic Continental klockan 17. Så där hoppas jag att vi möts allihopa. Och det här webbinariet spelas in och ni kan skriva era frågor i chatten så kan vi ta upp dem i slutet, tänker jag. Då lämnar jag över till Rosa.
Thank you, Marta. Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Rosa. Today we're going to talk about ground floors and my PhD that I defended last year in December. Usually when we look at like visions for ground floors in new areas, we see something like this. A lot of activity, a lot of diversity in ground floors. Colors are just wonderful. And the activities are just like countless. That is something that we all appreciate and want, and I think we all work for that. But usually we end up something like this. Obviously, these are Google images, and there aren't a lot of people usually when Google cars drive for some reason. But the colors are just not as imaginary as we wish. The activities are kind of low. It's sometimes a little bit hard to see through the glass windows what we actually see in the ground floors. And what I try to do in my research is to maybe wonder what happens when we imagine this and we end up with this, and how do we get something that is a little bit more lively and a little bit more attractive. It is a recipe for an attractive city, but what are exactly the ingredients? That is a lot that I think many of us are working with and interested in. How do you build an engaged community around that place? And what do you do when vacancy occurs? What if the spaces don't meet today's demands? And how many ground floors are actually feasible in this area? Those are a lot of questions that pop up. And there are a couple of bottlenecks that make it difficult for like municipalities, consultancies, and those that are working with that. There's a detailed plan with a vision. Then there's a developer that focuses on building and just selling. Then there's a property owner. That could be a bostadsrättsförening or a small private or a large company. And they are eventually in charge of working with the areas that were built. But at the same time, there are places for renovations that require a bygglov to open up the ground floor to the street. That's a lot of practices that we see happening. Also repurposing industrial areas into mixed streets. And so there, eventually often we end up with a chain store, a sushi and a pizza. And we work with the local conditions of the centrality and the economic capacity in the area. And those form some of these like difficult situations why we actually don't get the ground floors that we envision in the first place. So this is something that I researched for a couple of years at KTH. I looked mainly at ground floors in the inner city of Stockholm. I picked 4 main streets, those longer kind of streets that give structure to the map, like the the areas in Stockholm. So it's Odengatan, Hantverkargatan, Hornsgatan, Götgatan. And I looked at them as resilient public spaces. And to give you a quick insight into what I will be talking today, but also some of my main conclusions. What makes a central street a place? Those are ground floors for some part, but they're often forgotten. They are tricky to plan for in the Swedish planning system, but they offer a very meaningful place to many people. So it's something that we wish to preserve in some way, but it's hard. Property owners are a main actor in this. And through their gatekeeping role, we're losing small independent stores, and we invite retail gentrification. And this term I will be talking about later. What we would need is a consortium of actors, property owners, municipalities, shop owners to work towards a curated street management model, also in Swedish, platssamverkan. So when I started in 2016, I found it interesting that a lot of high streets in London, in the UK, started to erode, you can say. Shops were closing. People started to feel worried about the death of the high streets. And I started to follow this because I thought it was a very interesting public space. That is very meaningful to the city. And even academic scholars started to pick up on this and do research and write papers. That was super interesting. And from there, I started to wonder, how are the main streets in Stockholm doing? Is that the same? Can we see similar patterns? Is the same thing happening? But first, I wanted to understand, what is a main street in physical terms, in economic terms, social terms? So to give you a little bit of an overview of the literature that I reviewed, just to see that we're on the same page, that you know and understand what I mean when I talk about main streets. They are the backbone of the city. They create some kind of street hierarchy. They form a continuous urban form. They're embedded in the neighborhood. It's a go-to street for everyone that lives around the main streets. It's often built organically. They're unique in the terms of like the building types and the styles, and they connect different parts of the city through both public transit and pedestrian sidewalks and car lanes. And often they create a central public space in the neighborhood that everyone is somehow connected to. And in economic terms, they provide for diversity functions. You both find retail and non-retail. Often there's a large share of small independent businesses. And that also gives a good balance of chain stores and local businesses. It's been found that it's a startup habitat for chain businesses. Like the first one is open there, and then from there it starts to grow into a small chain. The unit sizes are often varied. There are small and larger ground floors. They generate wages to many. They offer a lot of jobs. The ownership of the buildings is multiple, different kind of property owners. And on the top floors, you find offices and residential. And in social terms, it's often a meeting place. It's not only shopping, it's often where many people meet. They enjoy leisure time. There's multi-shopping. So you go to a grocery, maybe also pick up something at a pharmacy and pick up flowers, something like that. It's often appreciated by tourists. They find their way. There are schools, local doctors, childcare, but also larger kind of major community services like libraries and medical centers. And often they're a symbol for pride and identity and belonging. And in the case of London, they actually presented some impressive numbers that over half of the London jobs are spread across these 600 high streets. Also, London has a city structure that's built on high streets, so I think that's a bit larger 2/3 of the Londoners live within 5-minute walk. Many people don't leave their area, and there's a lot of developable land. So there's a lot of potential in caring about main streets or high streets. I use these terms interchangeably, so no confusion there. So there started to be a lot of interest for developing the high streets in London for like obvious reasons. There was a lot of policies and strategies and all that, and that really caught my attention. I also started to wonder, like, many of these main streets have existed for at least 100 years. They're often built inspired by the Haussmann plans that have structured Paris you find today. And so you see the built environment, maybe, like the buildings and the roads, as some kind of continuity. And they also offer a source for resilience. Like, the built environment is there, what can we do with that? And that was really something that I found interesting to focus on. But what are actually the issues then, you wonder? So Matthew Carmona wrote this 100-page long paper back in 2015, and he identified some of the high street issues. There are issues with the physical fabric, the qualities of the street in terms of like the way it looks, the way it works, but also real estate issues. There's disinvestment, it's costly, the value is unsure, where the value of the properties are actually very valuable around an high street. The shopping or the exchange dimension is often undervalued. There was crime and fear of crime, movement issues. Was it a road or a street? Like, how do we actually perceive that from like a planning point of view? Is there pedestrian safety? There is poor servicing and parking, and there were management issues. Like, it doesn't fall within like one responsibility or one department of the municipality. Whereas there are a lot of different people coming to the main street. So it's a complex public space that is complex to manage. And another interesting research that looked into like both the value but also the issues of these local shopping streets was a research project run by Sharon Sukin. And they found that these places are taken for granted, whereas they're growing global spaces. You see a lot of different cultures and a lot of different ethnicities around that, the ground floors and the streets. And they did a large research in different cities, how they change. It was very interesting to follow. But how do we understand these changing streets? I wanted to apply or approach the street from a place perspective. And a street as a place was found by Appleyard and Jacobs already in the 80s and the 90s. It's where both community and mobility exist. And Gale has focused a lot of his work on the life between buildings. And it's exactly the life between buildings that gives a dimension that deserves more careful treatment. It gives safety, comfort, sociability, and liveliness. And it's the streets that makes the neighborhood and cities community-centered, healthy, inclusive, equitable, and ultimately more livable and sustainable and resilient. So approaching this from a place opens up to a wider set of values that we appreciate in urban planning.